I'm Lidy Nacpil and I'm coordinator of Jubilee South Asia Pacific Movement on Debt and Development. We are an alliance of movements across different parts of Asia, but we also belong to a global alliance of movements that is now addressing climate change or the climate crisis as one of the most important campaigns that we have today. And we must be able to point out very clearly that the responsibility for climate change lies on the shoulders of the rich developed countries or rich industrialized countries, because scientists have already attested to the fact that it is the historical emissions of these countries that is responsible for the huge density of greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere, which is responsible for the global warming, which is again responsible for climate change. And we must ask the rich developed countries or the rich industrialized countries to face up to this responsibility and their obligation to first cut their greenhouse gas emissions immediately and drastically, because this is the only way that we can avert more catastrophic climate change. And secondly, to provide the finance that is necessary so that peoples of the world, especially people of the developing countries, can deal with the impacts of climate change. In the climate negotiations, dealing with the impacts of climate change, which many are already irreversible, is called adaptation. So what we are saying is that climate finance is needed for adaptation. And the other reason for asking for climate finance is that there is also a large amount of mobilization of resources necessary in order for countries, including developing countries or countries of the South, to shift to low carbon pathways of development. The world can no longer afford high greenhouse gas emissions, cannot afford to have what is called high carbon development pathways, and that developing countries must begin to shift also in the same way that the rich countries must cut their greenhouse gas emissions drastically. And this process is called mitigation in the climate negotiations. We believe that a central question of climate justice is that those responsible for climate change, for the climate crisis, must pay their climate debt, must pay the reparations for the climate debt that they consequently owe the people. There is an untold amount of climate finance that is needed for these two different processes, adaptation and mitigation. The lowest estimate of developing countries is about $400 billion a year is necessary at the minimum just for adaptation, let alone mitigation. And in the climate negotiations, a key question is the obligation of the rich countries to provide this finance. And this obligation is in fact recognized officially in the climate convention that all parties have agreed to. Unfortunately, compliance to this obligation or to this agreement is another story. For now, the only commitment on the table is the so-called $30 billion of Fast Start climate financing, and the pledge for $100 billion a year, every year, clearly only until 2012, and it's still a matter of negotiations for beyond this period. And not only are we talking about the shortness of the insufficiency of this amount, $100 billion, $30 billion to $100 billion, we're also talking about much of this pledged amount as being not new money, meaning they're not really pledging any new money that they have not pledged before, mostly under official development assistance commitments. So they're not really pledging to give additional amount as part of their obligations for climate finance. We know, for instance, that the Belgian government has committed 150 million euros as part of the $30 billion Fast Start finance. And we also know that so far they have only come up with 67 million euros. So while Belgium is not the only country that must pay the obligation of climate finance, we believe that these amounts are very, very short of what is needed and what they must be responsible for committing to and coming up with. So right now, we think that one of the things that we all must cooperate with each other on is a strong global campaign to compel northern countries to face up to their obligations for the greenhouse gas emissions cuts, as well as for the climate finance that is needed by developing countries, by countries of the South, by peoples of the South. And not only because this is a need, but because this is an obligation for climate justice. We also have to have strong campaigns in the South to compel our own governments to meet up, to fulfill their own obligations to us, their citizens, because we don't believe either that they should just wait around for the finance that is coming from northern countries. We must also allocate our own domestic resources so that the much needed climate programs can be implemented immediately. And we are demanding that our governments also take the lead in developing climate programs that are participatory, that are designed with the people's needs in mind, that are appropriate to our conditions, because we, as I said in the beginning, we have no time to lose. We cannot wait. Thank you.